And welcome to Dateline London, the programme bringing together foreign correspondents based in London with BBC expertise. I'm Geetha Gurumurthy. After the crisis, the deluge. Keeping economies afloat has cost exchequers around the world a fortune. And now, as we peer towards the end of lockdown, thoughts are turning to how we pay the bills. Will there be a deluge of new taxes? The austerity of 2008 seems out of favour at the moment. So will there be continued flooding of spending? Will economic activity bounce back rapidly, or will tax revenues take a hit as unemployment rises? Well, it's often said that if there are three economists, there will be four opinions. And I'm joined today by Mark Roche from France's L'Emploi, Stephanie Baker from Bloomberg, and here in the studio, at a safe social distance, of course, the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and very welcome. Now, here in Britain, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, presents his budget next week. There is pressure from new Conservative MPs in the north, along with the Labour Party, for continued support through the pandemic and no tax rises. The hope is that economic growth and perhaps controlled inflation will do the trick. But what if it doesn't? Could future low productivity, low investment or a rise in interest rates all pose dangerous risks, especially for jobs? Simon, it's a massive week ahead, isn't it, in terms of it's post-Brexit for the first time for this budget, post-pandemic nearly, we're not out of the woods yet, and we're going to see the government's strategy here. What are you expecting?
I think there are two main challenges here. The government and businesses will need each other like never before. We're coming out of the worst slump in over 300 years. And we've moved in away from a protect and survive mode into a support mode, and then a growth mode is what we need next. Because if there's one thing that is the most powerful weapon to bring down debt as a percentage of your economy, it's growth. Because if you've got this debt to GDP relationship we always talk about, one of the best ways of getting that down is to increase the denominator. So GDP, keep that growing. And the other side, and if you have that, then also you can keep unemployment down, which will then keep the numerator of that fraction sort of under control. So there will be a big emphasis on growth, and I expect jobs, jobs, jobs to be the mantra running through the Chancellor's mind as he gets this. Remember, you've got a furlough scheme which at its peak was supporting 9 million jobs. That's down to about 4.5 million. The wild card is what happens when those measures are removed. Now, it seems to me almost guaranteed that he will extend the furlough scheme where the state supports wages. He'll also extend the business rates of business tax holiday. But what he'll say is that I have to be honest about the challenge of the public finances. It's nearly 100% of total national income, a level we haven't seen since the early 60s when we're in this long trajectory down from the Second World War. He's going to say, unless we get this under control, then our ability to borrow very, very cheaply from international investors, that window looks like it might close. And we're beginning to see the beginnings of that as bond yields, the amount that governments have to pay investors to lend to them, are beginning to raise. And the UK government and the UK is very vulnerable to those rises. A single 1% rise in those interest rates costs £25 billion. That's half the entire defence budget. That makes it vulnerable. So he will have to say, yes, I'm going to support business, but I'm going to need your help in paying it back, which is why I expect business taxes for him to indicate they will have to rise.
If I can bring Stephanie in, I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, for the government to pull the plug on funding and support. We are still in lockdown here in the UK, and yet this risk of such high borrowing is apparent.
Absolutely. And, I think the Chancellor has a difficult balancing act to try to, send off this message that he's being fiscally responsible, yet still pumping money into the economy to support, given the fact that so many businesses are shut down. Obviously, the big debate is how much is he going to go ahead and outline tax rises that many people in his own party, as well as the Labour Party, are opposed to. He has signaled that he will raise corporation tax, perhaps not immediately, but gradually over this Parliament as a way of plugging the holes in the budget. I think he does have room to do so. The UK has the lowest corporation tax in the G7, and the US is also, Biden has also signaled that, they could raise corporation tax. So I think the concern, from the Chancellor is that there is significant fiscal scarring to the economy that will leave not just the debt overhang from the COVID crisis, but a permanent gap in public finances that does leave the UK exposed to interest rate rises. I think that the estimate is something like 40 billion. So he's got to strike this balance between trying to stimulate the economy, try to get it back on its feet again, while making sure that there's enough income coming in. And it's incredibly difficult to figure out how quickly the economy will recover. I mean, the other question I have is, what kind of actual stimulus might he outline next week? The eat out to help out, will something like that be outlined again? People have saved an awful lot of money. Some people have saved an awful lot of money during the crisis. Other people, of course, lost their jobs and are in a much worse position. But there's a lot of pent-up demand and pent-up savings. Does he really need to do that kind of active stimulus, especially since many people now think that eat out to help out might have contributed to the second wave of infections that we saw in the autumn.
OK, let me bring in Mark Rush. I mean, this is the first post-Brexit budget. If we hadn't seen the last year's pandemic, we would have been asking lots of questions about the future of Britain in very different economic circumstances. The government is tackling both those challenges.
Well, the challenge of Brexit is not what we expect, because the effect will be mid-term on foreign investment, and will they use the UK as a springboard to Europe again, or will they just cater for the domestic market? So Brexit is, except the little thing we have seen, the little problems we have seen, has been quite a success short-term for the government, and the government doesn't have to occupy that, being too preoccupied by that. The big issue is, of course, like my two colleagues have mentioned, it's about how to relaunch the economy. And Britain is in a good situation, better than Europe, because the success of vaccination has given a sort of optimistic factor. And one can expect the economy to be back on some sort of keel, like in the US in the summer, while Europe will be the fourth quarter. And the problem is the consumption, because there's a lot of savings, and the economy in the UK is really based on two things: consumption and real estate, in order to give that growth. And consumption has to be delivered. Now, people might be very reluctant to spend when lockdown finished because they are afraid for the future. So he might think at a sort of big war bonds to take all these savings and put them into productive investment. Is one of the solution to get the consumption back.
Let me just very quickly, if I may ask you, just for sort of brief answers on this. But Simon, the politics of this and the personalities involved. The perception is that Boris Johnson is a sort of more one nation type figure, central within the Conservative Party, would be very reluctant to do anything that would damage his popularity, given there's the election cycle, obviously, is 2024 here. Rishi Sunak, perhaps a more more to the right of the party, more traditional. He has a hedge fund background. How much does that play into their decisions and their judgments, do you think?
A couple of things. Number 10 and number 11, where the Chancellor lives, are structurally designed to clash with each other. The Prime Minister wants to be generous. The Chancellor's got to say, oh, I'm not sure we can afford that. Also, you've got this, you're right, Rishi Sunak is by nature in his DNA, he's what we call, fiscally conservative. He wants to manage the finances. And historically, the Conservative Party has always said this is the defining line between us and the Labour Party, which is that we are a little bit parsimonious. We try and look after the household budget in a way. I think that is different. There is no, if you remember after the financial crisis, there was launched a programme which was then known as austerity. You could argue how austere it really was. But the government's very, very clear we're not going back to that, which means the only other way you can do this is by tax rises at some point. The other point I would make is we're dealing with a very different Conservative Party, which has a very different idea compared to historically about the role of the state. They think that it is a good idea for the state to get involved in certain areas. And And therefore, in this post-Brexit world, don't be surprised to see them doing things which you would think that looks a bit like picking winners, that looks a bit like state intervention into private markets. I think that will be a thing. I think both sides...
Net zero, etc.
Yeah, I think that exactly. Under the aegis of green and decarbonisation, you could see a lot of money going into areas and businesses that previously you wouldn't have seen.
And Marr, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because the Conservatives have sort of gone on to traditional Labour territory, the Labour Party leadership here, the opposition, saying they don't want any tax rises, and politics slightly upended, but in a way both parties wanting the same outcome.
Yes. On the whole, there's very difference today what the Labour Party, for the reasons Simon have said, they both are Keynesian. They want the state, they want to spend. So there's no difference, really. It's a bit more on social thing on that. But on the whole, it's quite extraordinary, Britain, when you compare to Europe, how stable the political situation is. You have a prime minister with a huge majority, very stable, got rid of Brexit, can concentrate, got the pandemics right, the vaccination at least. Then you go into Europe, and what do you see there? Macron has to be re-elected next year. There's a succession of Merkel. There are very weak government in Holland, in Belgium. And then you have the problem with the populists in Eastern Europe. It's a complete mess politically, while Britain is very stable.
OK, we will come back to you for more on Europe. But first of all, I just want to turn to America, because the approach of President Biden is crystal clear. Rather like Barack Obama in 2008, but on a vastly greater scale, the president is pumping money into the economy. A stimulus that is said to be worth $1.9 trillion will no doubt fund every proposed bridge and road programme in the nation. But do public works of this kind produce lasting benefits? The world is watching. Has America found the route out of the economic crisis? Or is this too much, as even a usually sympathetic commentator like Larry Summers fears? Stephanie, is this an overcorrection here in the US, or do you think this is what's needed?
Well, Biden's mantra is you can't spend too much. And so you saw yesterday the House of Representatives pass his stimulus bill, 1.9 trillion, which outlines these checks that will go out to tens of millions of Americans for, worth $1,400, an extension of the top up in unemployment benefits, $350 billion in state aid to local and state governments, $200 billion to schools, and lots more money for the vaccination program. So I think, Biden is coming at this learning the lessons from the aftermath of the financial crisis, when, of course, Obama, passed a stimulus package that was about half this size. And in retrospect, I think many economists believe that it was too little and that growth was sluggish. And if they'd come out bigger, the economy would have recovered more quickly. And so I think that is very much on the top of his mind. Now, of course, the concern is, like it was during the financial crisis, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, is that all this money, this gush of money, could fan inflation. Now, there was a lot of concern back in 2009 about that. It never panned out. We never had an inflationary situation emerge. This time, there is, again, still concern. There's an argument to be made that this time is different because this crisis has all been about the shutdown to the economy, businesses closing down, people stuck at home, a lot of people saving money. And so in addition to the fiscal and monetary stimulus, you're going to have that pent-up savings possibly feeding into higher inflation, which is what Larry Summers is, perhaps concerned that this is going to, overheat the economy.
Indeed, and he just quoting one line from his piece in the Washington Post. He says stimulus measures of the magnitude contemplated are steps into the unknown, and for credibility they need, clear statements of consequences being monitored closely. Mark Gorsh, if the US, obviously, everyone is going to follow the economic recovery, if that's what we're going to see in the US. And obviously, their currency helps them in terms of these stimulus packages. What's your view? This is a huge change, obviously, from Trump.
Yes, and it's very welcome. It's a traditional democratic New Deal policy, which the Democratic president and some Republican have followed. It's very welcome. The amplitude of it is quite staggering because, of course, there's always a danger, of course, of an increase of inflation, especially that if the growth is, and it looks like the US will start growing again in the summer, from the summer on. If the growth continue, raw material, and especially China is growing too, raw material price will go up. So there's a risk that inflation go up, that interest rate go up, etc., which is terrible for borrowing. But the US has never really bothered about borrowing, and they won't do it today either. I mean, we have lived with huge American deficit forever that I can remember.
We're seeing arguments, Simon, over the minimum wage, the Biden administration trying to double it to $15, and now that hasn't gone through in the last couple of days, but obviously the government, the administration is still committed to it. Just put us, give us a sense of scale for what's happening in the US.
Well, the US, the stimulus package looks like something like 9% of GDP. That's a massive number. If you compare that to the UK, the bit of the support package we've talked about, which you could call stimulus, is probably about 2%, so much smaller. In Europe, they're talking roughly around 4%. So you could argue that the UK stimulus package is actually pretty weak compared to its competitors. Very difficult to compare because the UK has been a bit more generous on the support side, on the furlough scheme. So which bucket do you put this money into? The question will be, as Stephanie was saying, the lesson from the financial crisis was that those who did more earlier did better. And so if Biden's saying I can't spend too much, people will say the lesson from the financial crisis in the UK was that we didn't fix our banks, for example, quickly enough, didn't pump enough money in. The US did. So most economists would say the risks are on doing too little, not on doing too much.
Fascinating. Well, let us go to Europe because growth has been sluggish. Unemployment, especially amongst the young, has been high for a decade now. Will the pandemic exacerbate the problems in the European economies? Will it open up structural cracks in the Eurozone with very different budgetary positions in the respective nations? Will the response in Europe be further integration of taxation, for example, or will the crisis lead to more division and fuel political populism? Mark, first of all, on the vaccine rollout, how key is that to economic recovery?
Well, it's a disaster, isn't it? First, the Commission didn't got its act together, and then you have the vaccine nationalism, everyone for their own. This has, of course, pushed back the return to a normal economy. And on top of it, it has really frozen all the reform that had to be done to get Europe on its feet again, which is labor market, capital market, youth unemployment. It has also exacerbated the fight between what I would call the more democratic countries and the authoritarian in the East. But more importantly, for the future, there's a huge crack now between the most fiscally conservative North, prosperous Scandinavia, Holland, Germany, and the southern spendthrift who need much more money at a time where the budget relaunch, which is quite big on the continent, has been plagued by bureaucracy, has been plagued by problems, political problems. So the whole situation in Europe is not very good. On top of it, there are political issues coming, especially that the hard core of Europe, which is France and Germany, are going to uncertainty. You know, Macron could be defeated by the National Front in next year's election, and the succession of Merkel isn't completely done. So Europe is going to a very difficult time. And also, and this is the most important thing, Europe hasn't taken advantage of Brexit contrary to what they thought, except maybe in the financial service, and it's quite little. So not good at a time for Europe and the Eurozone.
It's fascinating, isn't it, to see the contrast between East and West, Stephanie, when we look at what's happening in Europe, the UK, the US compared with Asia. How do you read events in the EU at the moment?
Yeah, the Eurozone has suffered a more dramatic economic fallout downturn than the US, yet I think the EU has responded much more weakly in terms of trying to get, the Eurozone economy back on its feet again. I think even before the crisis, there was some pushback against the bloc's fiscal rules that required economies to keep their budget deficits to 3% of GDP and overall debt burdens to like 60% of GDP. I think that's obviously going to have to be relaxed now. And that was, already in the works pre-crisis. But I think that, the EU, Eurozone really needs to respond with more, dramatic measures to try to get the economy back on its feet, especially, as Mark was saying, because the vaccine rollout has been so slow. So they will be behind both the US and the UK because their economies won't be able to reopen as quickly.
Simon, again, the politics of this through the Brexit lens, obviously not such a massive focus as it might have been given the pandemic, but how does it look? Has it benefited the government here, looking at what's happening in the EU?
Well, listen, there are clear problems that Brexit has created for some traders getting stuff into the EU. There are some significant non-tariff barriers, but I think all of that has been put to one side. I think the vaccine rollout has dominated this debate. Both that, the UK has been very effective in doing that, and not only that, but obviously the size and complexity of the EU has meant that a coordinated fiscal stimulus response to this to the pandemic has also been hard to organise. So at the moment, I think the UK government is feeling in a pretty good place about this, because they say, to them, they'll be basking in the glow of this vaccine rollout success for a long time to come, and it will have economic benefits. So I think at the moment the government will be pretty happy that they are in the right kind of place. Just one point I would like to make that Mark brought up, which is about younger people. I think, you asked the question about generational divide. If you look at the hardest hit sectors across all of Europe, in every country, hospitality, retail, tourism, retail is many people's first experience of the world of work. It's a job on a shop on a Saturday, it's whatever. And that is, so the younger people have suffered much more in this than others. And I think one of the big challenges for governments, not just in the UK, and expect to hear some about this on Wednesday in the budget, will be what can we do for young people because the big wild card is how many of those jobs which are on furlough no longer really exist. Yeah. So when they go back to work, how many of them still exist? And if they don't exist, what are these people going to do, particularly younger people? That will be a big focus. And
we talk about regional inequality in the north, but actually London's been very heavily hit on, very vulnerable, isn't it, with hospitality?
Well, they have incredible ecosystems built up around consumer and office worker footfall. Yeah. The people who fix your shoes or launder, dry cleaning, or your sandwich joint or the coffee, whatever. A lot of those are very young workers. They rely on heavy concentration of people coming into city centres. They've been very, very badly hit.
Women also hit, I think, according to some of the data around the world. Stephanie, just on Europe, lots of us are wondering whether we can go on holiday to Europe, and that is partly linked with the vaccine rollout and, the sort of economic success that goes with it. I know you've been doing some work on that, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, as probably everyone, we're all eager to go on holiday to someplace warm and sunny. I think that is a real question mark over Europe because of the slow vaccine rollout. In some places, France in particular has been very slow and behind schedule. I did, speak with the Greek tourism minister this week, and he has some pretty bold, ambitious plans to reopen tourism in Greece, and is talking, as we know, the UK government about opening up, striking an agreement, allowing travelers to come who have been vaccinated, it looks like possibly without testing. I think what we're going to see is a mix of, some sort of proof of vaccination and testing regimes to try to get tourism going again this summer. But I don't know about you, but it is a question in my mind. Do I really want to go on holiday in Europe this summer if, the vaccination program is slow and there might be more COVID circulating? And I think I'm probably not alone in that regard.
Mark, just 30 seconds. What's your sense of where Europe is heading this summer on this front?
Come to Europe. It will be marvelous this summer in France. Can you imagine not spending a holiday in France?
No, I can't.
I'm going. I'm vaccinated. I'll go to France.
I'm coming with you, I think, Mark, if that's all right. Thank you very much.
Even Stephanie will come with me.
Simon, what about you? UK or you?
I spent the last 2 days with my 18-year-old who's about to finish her A-levels looking at places in Greece to go, and but what we were looking for is, can we refund this if suddenly we can't go? That was the big issue.
So we are all doing our bit to boost the European economy this summer if we can possibly get to the Mediterranean. Simon, Mark, Stephanie, thank you so much for your time today. Very grateful to you. That's it for Dateline London this week. We are back next week at the same time. Bye for now.